Okay, so welcome to everyone to tonight's Master Gardener's presentation on what bees are these and how to incorporate wild bees into our garden and landscape. My name is Lauren Paz. I am the chair of the Speakers Bureau, and I will be moderating the presentation tonight. We ask that you use the Zoom chat box to be directed to everybody for questions that you have. And at the end of the series, I will relay all questions to the speaker. We will have approximately 15 minutes allotted for questions at the end of the presentation. We will also be posting the link to the University of Arizona website where the recording and PowerPoint presentation can be found within a few days. Tonight's presentation is courtesy of the University of Arizona. We are Master Gardener volunteers for the Yavapai County Cooperative Extension. This is an outreach arm of the University of Arizona College of Agricultural and Life Sciences. And we provide science-based horticultural information to the public by staffing horticultural helplines in both Camp Verde and Prescott Extension offices, as well as by presenting talks such as this. And Yavapai County currently has over 200 active master gardeners ready to help you at any time. We are planning our next presentation for Thursday, July 1st at 6:30. The topic will be grafting by Kathleen Coram. And we will also in the future be having presentations on rainwater harvesting, winter vegetable gardening, and many more, so stay tuned. With that, I'd like to present our guest speaker tonight, Dianna Kadonaga. Dianna is a recent graduate of the Yavapai County Master Gardeners Program. She's a pollinator specialization advocate and a Franklin County Master Gardener in Columbus, Ohio. She turned her urban lawn into a vibrant ergonomic ecosystem and permacultural-based edible food forest that provided her enough food so she only had to go grocery shopping 4 times last year during the pandemic. Sunny Glen Garden has become an educational demonstration garden for the community, presented with the Green Spot Light Award from the City of Columbus for excellence in sustainable business practices. And she's been featured in local media on self-sustainability, zero waste, and eco-friendly lifestyles, showing how we can all live in harmony and share in the bounty of nature. One of Dianna's passions is creating an environment that is bee-friendly. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dianna. Let's get started. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank Lauren and Tricia for helping me figure out how to do all these presentations and everything and getting set up here. And I appreciate the introduction, but I'm very excited, buzzing with excitement here, bee puns intended. But I'm actually in Columbus, Ohio now, working with many others on our first ever statewide Ohio bee survey, and also setting up a Manitou grant project to plant native plants for specialist bees, as well as heading a local Audubon native seed project for songbirds in my songbird gardens in my community. And so I'm needing to be here for now, as I'm also growing and taking care of about 3,000 native Ohio plants that I grew from seed for the first time in my basement. And these projects came up, but I'm hoping to be back in Prescott when things go dormant. So I'm fairly new to native bees and really new to Prescott, but I have a lot to learn, especially because you have so many more native bees out there than in Ohio, but I'm having a great time learning about them. And so this is what I'll be sharing with you today. And so just taking a moment, what are the first 3 things that come up for you when someone mentions bees? Because what I hear most from folks are things like honey, or maybe getting stung, or beehives. And so much of our information is based on honeybees, which are actually not native to North America, having been brought from Europe. And yet honeybees are not really representative of the majority of our native bees, who have lifestyles that are very different than our honeybees. And these 2 guys here in the photograph, for example, are not honeybees, but are out for a drink together for the nectar on the Gaillardia, or blanket flower. And so it's a longhorned Melisodes bee on the left with its unusually long antenna, and it will be found hanging out together with other male longhorn bees, grabbing on with their jaws from the stems of plants to sleep for the night. And the females do not live in colonies but are solitary and will nest in the ground to create their brooding cells. And so these longhorn bees are irreplaceable pollinators for garden flowers, native wildflowers, and sunflower crops. And this larger bee on the right-hand side is a brown-belted bumblebee, or Bombus Graciocalis. It's actually not usually found in the Southwest, but you may be able to see the two dark brown stripes across the abdomen just below the yellow back. I'm not sure if you can see that in the photograph, but these stripe patterns on the head and the back and the abdomen will give clues to help identify it from other bumblebees. And so it can help to know more about these wild bees, so we know how we can best support them for their survival, and to not inadvertently do things in our garden that are detrimental to their survival, because there's a lot of things I was doing that I didn't realize were really reducing their habitat, or actually maybe even harming the bees that were already there. So I'd like to go through some of the common misconceptions about bees that have been derived from our immigrant honeybees, in hopes to highlight some of these differences from the rest of our honeybees. And so I think we all know a lot about honeybees because of the beautiful honey that, that they are meant to feed and provide energy for themselves that we get to enjoy. But an average worker honeybee will produce 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in its maybe 6-week-long lifetime average. So the pound of honey, like you see in the jar, requires approximately 556 honeybee workers that will fly approximately 4,600 flight miles to gather that 1 pound of honey from about 2 million flowers. And so that's one of the reasons that we need a lot of flower sources for them. And so worker bees are good names for as one honeybee will visit 50 to 100 flowers during each collection trip, gathering pollen and nectar from a single floral species. And so usually it's easy to see their bright yellow or orange colored pollen baskets or corbiculae on their hind legs of the honeybees. But this one, if you get a load of this one, it has really dark purpley pollen pockets. And it came from visiting my oriental poppy with these deep chocolatey brown colored centers. And so that's why when you get honey, you can get spring honey. Very often it'll be a different color than the fall honey or clover honey, because bees will be specializing or sort of staying with certain plants then that it likes and works well for it, and it tends to flavor and color the honey. But as mentioned, honeybees are an anomaly of the bee world, and honeybees and some bumblebees are part of less than the 4% of all the bees that actually make honey. But bees need to drink nectar, and most need to collect pollen for their babies, which is why they're still all visiting the flowers. And so I couldn't find my photo of the bumblebee flight studies, but because the bumblebees are larger, they were able to put these tiny little antennae attached to their backs. And so these researchers were able to trace their patterns of flight. And so the first flights were all over the place, as you see the bees sort of scouting for flower sources and then coming back to the hive. So the lines are all kind of jiggly. And then quickly though, it went back and forth to the same area or group of flowers. And then it would shift to another source of flowers and then go in that direction back and forth until those sources were used up, or until a new or better source was found. And so it never became more clear to me how the term making a beeline came about, because they need to be efficient and find the best sources that are close by. But not all bees are hard workers. About 15% of our native bees are in the genus Nomada, which are cuckoo bees. And cuckoo bees, like cuckoo birds, lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. They look a little bit like wasps because they often lack the pollen carrying, like the scopa, because they don't need to do that. What they do instead is they wait until the host nest leaves the nest, inserts their own eggs into the wall of the host cell, and then when the larval parasite emerges later, after the cell has been closed by the host female, it kills the host larvae. And so the first instar larvae of these nomads are specially adapted for this and possess really long mandibles that they use to kill the host larvae. And so as soon as the larvae molts into the second instar, basically it'll lose those mandibles, and then it simply feeds on the pollen that the host bees provided in there. And so these bee buddies are, I thought, were just the cutest things when I saw these hairy guys. They're a bunch of two-spotted longhorn male bees, and they're all hanging out together like this to sleep at night while grasping, I said, onto the plant stems or leaves with only their mandibles after they've spent the day flying around looking for females during the day. And so the females will be nesting in the ground under the brush where they collect pollen balls and lay their eggs. And the males have these extra long antennae, which they often use. I've seen videos of them actually stroking the antenna of the females that they mate with. And again, the idea of living in hives is I think because of our honeybees, non-native honeybees, we're most familiar with them, but they're more of an anomaly again. And so the honeybees have this kind of highly eusocial in a structure where they can have 40,000 bees maybe or more in one nest. They have advanced communication. The queen works with many generations of her young and can live 2 or 3 years, and basically cannot survive without her attendants who feed her and things like that. And the queen bee will be larger and has a different shape, but less than 2.5% of these bee species nest in hives. But these are when I had honeybees in my yard. I fell in love with them, but they're unable to survive now without assistance and are more like having a pet, as they require feedings to get through the winter and mite treatments. And I'm sort of wondering if the queen breeding that we're doing to have the bees have traits that suit us in terms of being less aggressive or produce more honey might be actually breeding the survival ability out of them. And so there's also been studies where bumblebees that have been bred and used in greenhouses to buzz pollinate our tomatoes have been found to have diseases. And when they escape and go into the landscapes, they often share those diseases or other pests with the native bee populations. And there's also studies that show that when there are honeybees, native bees are less. And in many ways that makes sense just from the standpoint of competition for food sources. And so how do most of these native bees live? 70% of them are ground nesters. So it's important to leave undisturbed earth, open ground for their nesting sites, as this has implications for gardeners to limit those weed barriers, whether they be cloth or gravel or mulch. I know it's convenient for us to reduce the weeds, but not very good for the 70% of the native bees who are ground nesters. So even if you leave small areas of open soil, this can help provide habitat for them. And many bees, like in this photograph, you'll see have face plates which they rub on the ground and rotate in circles. You'll see the middle one has built a little mud fortress entrance. And so the ground nesting bees will collect that pollen to make a big pollen ball, lay the egg, and then seal it off with mud. And so some ground nests can be quite extensive and literally go down 9 feet in the ground. They've tried to dig them up and see, and some of them might be used the next year. So if you can avoid tilling in your garden, that would be helpful too, so you don't destroy these nests. And so the other 30% of our native bees are cavity nesters, like these leafcutter bees in my raspberry canes. They're about 10 cells made from the leaves and the stem that the female bee collects herself. And again, she collects the pollen, which will be food for the baby, and lays the egg, and then seals off each cell with more leaves before she makes the next cell. And then she just does this over and over again. And so it requires several trips to collect the leaves, to line the cells, and several more to collect the pollen that will be left in the cell for the pupae as it grows into the larval stage before becoming an adult and leaving the nest. And so the leafcutter bee has large mandibles, so can chew out pieces of leaves or petals. And here's what the leafcutter bee did on my leaves on the rose bush. She cuts out these circular pieces with her large mandibles, and then she rolls it up in her legs. And then she flies back with to her cavity nest in a stem, or in this case, a downspout, to line and create a cell or a room where she'll collect the pollen and lay those eggs in the leaf cells. And so if you see these perfectly round holes in your leaves that resemble a hole punch, you can celebrate, because that's a good sign that you have leafcutter bees around. They were brought to Europe to help with alfalfa seed crops in the mid-1900s, and But it turns out they're also great for carrots and other vegetables. So lots of farmers buy their cocoons and scatter them around the fields. And it's a solitary bee related to the mason bees, using those leaf rounds to line the nests. And so leaving your native plants up, or the old stems of native plants or raspberry canes up all winter, will ensure their survival, as they will overwinter in them and come up the following year. And so as gardeners, we're usually told to prune old canes out to make space and clear them out in the fall. But this actually kills and removes all the baby bees that might be in those stems. And so we can still remove any diseased ones, but otherwise leave them up, or at least a few of them, instead of pruning them up and cleaning them up. I left all of mine up, old raspberry canes up last year, and every single one of them had these tiny little holes on top where I saw the little bees go in and out of them. And so the pollination of my raspberry patches has just been phenomenal and increasing every year in production and quality with the native bees around. And so if you feel compelled to clean up your old stems or clean up your garden, then at least only cut them down to 18 inches. And that way in the spring, when the new growth comes up, it'll come right over the top and cover it up. All right, and then just to show, there's different native wild bees that use different materials for the nest. On the top left, the shells that are sealed off with sand and pebbles after collecting the orange pollen and leaving an egg to hatch, and then, or a rock fortress built with pebbles, the mud on the bottom left, and a stick nest on the right bottom there too. And this is a wool carder bee gathering the fuzz off of lamb's ear for nesting material. There's some studies that recommend planting lamb's ears or furry geraniums to attract them. And these particular wool carder bees are actually non-native. And they're also now finding that they're more aggressive than our native carder bees. And so, these are the kinds of things we kind of have to watch out when we're bringing in a lot of these other things, even though we might have good intentions. And so again, most of the information we have is about honeybees, like in this photo, which are social creatures that live in groups with delineated responsibilities. And so the blue finger, I'm not sure if you can tell, is pointing to the queen, who is larger and has a different look than her worker bees. And she stays in the hive to lay all the eggs. The female worker bees have special jobs to feed the young or gather pollen or guard the hive or fan the hive to maintain temperatures. The male drones are for mating with the queen. And so the whole hive will stay alive over the winter, usually with fewer honeybees, as the males will again get kicked out because they use those valuable resources. And so honeybees and some native stingless bees and bumblebees, and also many of the sweat bees will have queens and workers, but only a fraction of the bee species are social, basically less than 8%. And so the rest of those bees then are solitary, single ladies, meaning they are headed by a single queen. She does all the chores herself with site selection, builds the house, collects the pollen, and lays those eggs. And after that, she seals up the cells and repeats it over again before she dies. And so the female is the queen, the worker bee. She does all the work herself. And again, those guys have one important task to mate, but otherwise don't contribute to the rest. And so some of these solitary bees can nest together in big patches like the polyester bees. And I'm not sure if you can tell in this photograph, but you might see all these tiny little dirt mounds. Each female is still the queen of her own nest. But this is why it's important to have open ground areas, maybe on edges of garden paths, or leave spots open. And so other solitary bees might share the same nest entrance, but have separate nesting quarters, maybe like a apartment building with a common foyer and front entrance with up to 40 apartments. And so the alkali bee has these nest entrances. Alfalfa farmers often make use of alkali bees. Again, it's a solitary bee, but they will nest in huge groups, and sometimes the sisters will share a nest entrance. And you'll see how the nests are dug into the ground here on the right, and the soil is brought up to form the little mounds on top. And then they create the separate chambers off the main tunnel, which will house a little baby bee. So if you can leave the unplowed ground for them, or make it, some people have made nesting sites out of gravel and sand and piled them up. For example, in Walla Walla, Washington, for these alkali bees on the farm so that they can pollinate their alfalfa crops. And so understanding the life cycle of a typical native bee that nests in the ground can kind of inform us for tweaking our garden practices, maybe to be more inclusive and accommodate them. And so this is an example of an Adrena mining bee. She will spend a year underground and going through those 4 phases. And so the adult female on the right will dig that nest in the ground. There's bees that will line that nesting site. Sometimes they'll secrete a substance like cellophane to line these cavities, which actually make them waterproof. And so once she does that, the pollen is collected, the egg is laid on top. On the bottom there, you see the larvae grow as it eats, and the pupil stage on the left looks like a transparent white adult. And so it will come out again as it emerges the next year. And so I can understand why honeybees might get upset with humans opening up their homes or ripping off their roofs of their houses, pulling out the walls with their food and their babies in it. But in my experience, with honeybees at least, they respond to my anxiety level. And so if I'm calm, they're calm. If I'm panicking and afraid, they'll go into high alert mode. So if I usually just take some really deep breaths to facilitate my relaxation response when I'm working with the hive, I find that that's been very helpful, and they just kind of continue on doing their business. And I've asked, if you're around honeybee hives, I've stood in front of the entrance to observe them, and they'll fly and bonk me right into the back of the head because I'm in the way of their entrance, which is kind of like a runway. So for honeybees, don't stand in front of their entranceway, but for the to the side. But for most wild bees, human breath contains, the carbon dioxide, as well as like a cocktail of compounds of ketones, alcohols, and esters. And so over millions of years, insects have learned that if they sense this combination of smells, it probably means a bear, or maybe, I don't know, honey badgers coming to wreck their home and devour their young. And so in saying that, however, only female bees can sting. Males cannot. So that eliminates the possibility of half the population you have to worry about stinging you. The stingers on the females are actually a reproductive organ called the ovipositor, which is an egg-laying tube. And so this particular photo of the native bee on my hand is a metallic sweat bee. And so I'm like the human salt lick for the sweat bee. When I perspire, they're attracted to the perspiration that has some essential nutrients for them. But many of the native bees are actually tinier than this. So most people won't even notice if a little tiny bee comes onto their arm or their leg. But here are some tips to avoid being stung if you're afraid of this. You can hold your breath so you don't produce the carbon dioxide, and keep your head down so they don't think you're a mammal. Likewise, wearing light colored clothing to avoid looking like these mammals that come after their food. And I don't know if it's possible, but if you can, really see if you can avoid flailing your arms and yelling, because that's likely to be more threatening to them. So do whatever you need to stay still and relaxed, as the bees will pick up on your tension. And most often they're coming to check you out to see if you're a flower. And so sight and sound are far less important for smells for insects. So avoid wearing strong perfumes or scented shampoos or soap, and especially lemongrass scent, because I make my own lemongrass detergent, and unbeknownst to me, 7 honeybees followed me into the house because lemongrass is an essential oil that is often used to attract honeybee scouts to an empty hive to have them use it, because the lemongrass essential oil actually mimics the pheromones of the queen honeybee. But basically all I had to do was catch them in a jar and release them back outside. Or you can become like this entomologist who's actually from the University of Arizona. His name is Justin Schmidt, and they call him the king of sting. And he purposefully got himself stung, I think it's over 1,000 times, by 100 different insect species for science. And he has a book called The Sting of the Wild, where he quantified all of these stings and ranked them on a scale of 1 to 4, called the Schmidt Sting Pain Index. And so on the low end are sweat bees and southern fire ants. On the high end are like warrior wasps and bullet ants. So if you have a chance to check that out, it's pretty amusing. Not sure that would be what I would like to do, but that's what he's done. So just to summarize, with regard to our wild bees, most of them do not make honey or live in hives. Most are solitary, and only those females can sting, not the males. And so many of you likely already know the importance of the bees and have heard that like 1/3 of every bite depends on pollinators. This was just a visual sample. If you go grocery shopping for produce, this is what your grocery store produce section might look like, with pollinators. So you see all the bins are filled in the front here, along the back, everything is full. And I think they did this in Whole Foods to simulate this. But in the next slide, as you see here, many of those produce will be missing from there. And so we're just sort of, you won't have a lot of these things. And they're saying approximately 35% of our crop production worldwide depends on pollinators. And so you'd be missing apples, peaches, your pears and plums, grapefruits, oranges, blueberries, like all your berries, blackberries, raspberries, cranberries, and then your cucumbers and watermelons, cantaloupe, pumpkins, as well as your almonds, avocados, onions. And so that's a lot of food that we would not have. And so basically, even if we cared about the value of all the creatures and the wildlife, there is an estimated value that pollinators contribute to farm income, which is a staggering 29 billion. And this is from 2010. And the native bees also can do this as well. Some of them that do come back to certain areas, it's more difficult because honeybees have the hives to return to, but these native bees, a lot of them don't necessarily come back to that hive, or they'll have different locations each time. So it's, I guess, the one of the citizen science projects also that I was involved with here at The Ohio State University was for the sweet peppers. And so for a pepper plant to produce a peck of peppers to pick, proper pollination is a prerequisite. And so with that tongue teaser, even though there are plants that are self-pollinating, it's been shown that pollinators can increase the quantity and the quality of the fruits. And so this little ghost cloth that you see in the garden on the top is actually mesh, fine mesh, so that it allowed the wind and rain, but no pollinator access. And so on the bottom left, you'll see the sweet pepper plants that were produced without the pollinators, and then the ones that were produced with. And so they had this whole, many of us do this, and so it was very apparent how much the pollinators helped out, even on pollinator crops on crops that don't require the pollinators. And also anywhere between 75 to 90%, depending on your source of flowering plant species, are dependent on insect pollination. And 20 to 45% of native bees are pollen specialists, meaning they use pollen only from one species or genus of plants. And so, there's been a lot of concerns with climate change, as it's been observed that some plants are coming out earlier with global warming, and the bees have not had time to adjust, and so are coming out later, leading to these mismatches. And so, even when we have more severe weathers, the impacts, they're doing studies now with the studies of the fires that you have out there in Arizona and the impact or increasing intensity of heat. Basically because we're removing all this habitat and their plants that they need, if the plants go away, the bee goes away, or if the bees are removed, the plants aren't able to reproduce. So it becomes very important. And as they fertilize plants that culminate in the production of seeds and fruit for many of our animals that depend on them. Basically then, I just wanted to mention again, one more thing about our non-native honeybees that were, how many of you are aware of the transportation by the truckload of honeybees around the country for their pollination services? The map on the right of the US shows location and routes that honeybees travel, by truck. And basically, like in every February, the California almond industry requires about 1.6 million hives of honeybees to pollinate about 760,000 acres of almonds. And so 1.2 million of those 1.6 million honeybee hives come from out of state. And so that's over 2,600 truckloads of beehives, where each hive has an average of 40,000 bees per hive that enter California to support this $8 billion fruit, nut, and seed and fiber industry. And, there are border inspections to make sure they're free of invasive pests. But, as we know, just like with COVID, when you have about 80% of the entire honeybee bee population of the US in one location at a time, just the implications of that, just like with large gatherings of people, and germs and diseases can easily spread. So there's an increased risk of them, being wiped out. And many of them, their immune systems are down, as when they go to these orchards and crops, they're often sprayed with pesticides or herbicides that are often chemical poisons for them. And so, they are feeding on one crop for the entire time, which is pretty extreme. So it's hard to balance that nourishment. Just because I like potatoes, I don't necessarily want to be eating only potatoes for 6 weeks. And so, they're used to traveling up to 6 miles to and from their hives. But when they travel for miles, they're changing environments, where they move, to Michigan for the cranberry bogs, or taken down to Texas to pollinate the watermelons. It can lead to a lot of stressful situations. And so having a diversity of native bees, many of which are 90% better pollinators than our honeybees, can be vitally important. And so one of the best things you can do is to avoid using those any pesticides or herbicides on your own property. And so I think many of you are familiar with the colony collapse disorder that we had earlier on. My experience with honeybee keeping friends here in Ohio who are experienced lost 70% of their hives last year. And so, and also we're sourcing a lot of our bees from Georgia or Florida, or maybe you are doing it from California. So they're not necessarily adapted to our local environment. And so, there's been research about feral or wild honeybee colonies possibly handling varroa mites, better or more effectively than the commercial honeybee biting behavior. And so there's a lot that needs to go into that, just as there is for the native bees, because we don't really have that baseline of information. We don't really know, how they're doing. But the honeybees were going down from 4.5 million down to less than half of that from 1980 to 2005. And so this looks like the trend is reversing since then, but it's extremely difficult to raise honeybees now without input, as they need the supplemental either sugar water or bee food or treatments. And so they're also saying, wild bees in the last 5 years is in decline, but because we don't know a lot of that, we're not really sure where the population started. And so we're just doing our first Ohio statewide bee survey here this year. And so the first of many, our rusty patch bumblebee, is now on the endangered species list. And so, all these threats that are there with lack of habitat, fewer food resources, honeybees and bumblebees are generalists when it comes to feeding, so they can go to a lot of plants. But the specialist bees, if they don't have that plant or family, they don't have food basically to survive. And so we'll see if we can shift this, just with, that's why our gardens become really important. And so if we look at how many species of bee are actually out there, how many would you guess that there would be of bee species worldwide? Because I was kind of surprised that there are, again, 20 to 40,000 of them, because many of them are still being identified as different species or being found. And in the US alone, any guesses for there? We have about 4,000. And in Arizona, you actually have quite a few, 1,100. And so just taking a look at this number of bee species by state, what do you notice with the number of bees as you go towards the southwest? And so as you head to the southwest, there's more bee diversity in Arizona, New Mexico, California, because bees prefer those deserts and drier areas. And so Arizona has one of the largest and the smallest bees, a Carpenter Bee, which to me are easier to identify because they're so large. And you can delineate them from other large bees like bumblebees, because Carpenter bees usually have that shiny hiney, or the and whereas the bumblebees have the fuzzy butts. And so, but the Carpenter bees are really loud. They're fast flyers. They can sort of hover. Whereas the Perdita is very, very tiny and will usually stay within 100 feet of where its nesting site is. It's super tiny. But there are 7 main families of bees. And as you'll see there, we've kind of mentioned one from each of these families of bees. And there's one that is actually only found in Australia. And so they also belong in the order of Hymenoptera, which comprises about, I think, 150,000 species. And of those, 30,000 are bees. But that also includes sawflies, parasitic wasps, stinging wasps, and ants. And so basically we'll just continue on here with BID, because I think that's helpful for knowing, so we can determine what they are and we know better how to support them. But when I first started, I didn't realize that many of the insects I was looking at were actually bees, or I didn't realize, or I was confusing flies and wasps for bees. But I found this information helpful for learning. And so once you know what a bee is, you can get to know their life cycle, how they live, coordinate your pesticide and herbicide applications if you do that, or when you mow, or do burn applications when you till. So at least we can do the least harm and include them in our gardens. And one of the reasons, though, that bee identification is difficult is demonstrated in this photo. So across the top, that row is all wasps, and in the middle row, those are all bees, and in the bottom, those are all flies. So as you can see, to maybe an untrained eye, they may all look alike. And I'm taking these weekly BID classes with Sam Drogi in the Bee Lab as we go through this Discovery Life online key of features so that you can identify to species. And usually you need a microscope so you can look at wing venations. But we're just going to go over some larger features that you might be able to catch as they fly by. No pun intended. All right, so we'll go over some basic features to assist with BID versus the fly. And so if you look at the fly on the left and the bee on the right, what do you notice about their antenna? So, the flies will have these short, stubbly antenna, whereas the bees have those fairly large, longer antenna. And if you continue on about their waistlines, I mean, it's kind of hard to know, but the bees will tend to have thicker waistlines. And if you look at, their hairiness, the bees will usually be hairy because they have those efficient pollen collecting devices, except for those cuckoo bees that don't need it because they use other nests of other bees. And flies have hair, but you can't really call them hairy relatively. And the eyes, also, if you look at the eyes, flies have these very large eyes that are more towards the front of the head, and they're often really close together, almost meeting on top, whereas bees have fairly large eyes, but they're usually sort of more towards the side of the head. And then, so you can look for those features with the pollen collecting hairs, a longer antenna, the thinner waists, but also flies will have 2 sets of wings, one set of wings, so 2 wings total. And bees will have 2 sets of wings, or 4 in total. All right. And so as we go along here, if we're looking just based on those characteristics, which of these would you consider are bees in the first row? If bees have longer antenna, rounder waistlines, are hairier. This is our Bombus fervidus here in the first row with the blue ass fly and the clouded butterfly. And then these 3 along here are our mason bee, leafcutter bee, and our blue bee, or Osmia ribiflorus. And then in the bottom row is our honeybee, which many of you might already know about. As well as this sweat bee, which are often have these metallic green colors. The middle one is on number 9 is a velvet ant, which is actually a wingless female wasp. But it also makes it more difficult to identify bees properly, because things like this, which says "Save the Bees," if you look at that photograph, I don't know if any of you know what that is, but that's actually a cicada. And so, they have that very loud sound. We have the cicadas coming out here in that 17-year loop. And so many of them been out. And even, with our children, there are these puzzles with bees that they say, but it's actually, with those short stubbly antenna and the bulbous eyes kind of coming together and only 2 sets of wings, that's a hoverfly. And so we'll next move on to delineating the difference between wasps and bees. And so if you look at their head on the left and then the abdomen with that yellow dot, or the thorax on the right, wasps are less hairy and they don't have, those pollen carrying devices. Whereas the bee, there are sometimes they have split ends on their hair. They look hairier in general, but there's always those exceptions. And then if it has that silvery kind of metallic glint on the front of its face, it's almost always a wasp. And a lot of the wasps also tend to have those pencil thin waists. But a lot of times you might be able to tell more from their behavior if they're, flying too fast or whatnot. Because even though wasps might look longer and skinnier or have that kind of pencil thin waistline on a lot of them, they'll also have like these grasping uh, barbs on their legs, so that they can, because they're predators, they're carnivorous, and so they don't run around. They're on the ground looking for insects, and bees will be, busy going from flower to flower, as sort of more the vegetarians. And so if we're looking at wasps versus bees, again, we have sort of hard to tell, but basically these are your bees here. As opposed to your yellow jacket wasp and your mud dauber with that very thin waist on the left bottom, and the European paper wasp on the top right. And so wasps, to me, I actually think have been the culprit of a lot of this, what people are calling bee stings, because I found that bees are really not that aggressive at all, whereas wasps are much more aggressive. And so, if it's a wasp, I'd be more concerned about the wasp than I would about bees. You pretty much have to be abusing them or blocking their entrance or handling them for them to start to worry about stinging you. And so this one, I just wanted to show this in the backyard, because when you plant, more of these native plants and things in, this is actually, these two are actually not bees, but I put them here. There's a bald-faced hornets on the bottom left. And they have those. Oh, that was just my joke for like, this is the one you count in your sleep, but because maybe people fell asleep because of the Zoom going too long. So I was just putting that on. Are you able to share the screen, see the screen?
Yeah, we see it now.
Okay, but this is the the iNaturalist. Basically, when you upload it, there are people that are, geeks in the field who will help you ID it. It can, you can put in a location and generalize it, and it can be used for research as well. And so I also have these sort of bee specimen kits to help those ID. And then, this is a Carpenter Bee from your area. Stephen and I had been walking at night, and I kept hearing these loud buzzy sounds of the Zalacopa, which was in the wood of one of the raised garden beds at Manzanita Village. But basically, they've adapted to the extreme heat of Arizona by coming out at dawn and dusk when it's cooler. Again, some of these bumblebees with their different stripes on them that you can identify with these different patterns of colors to identify them, and they can nest, in loose flower pots or rodent burrows or compost heaps, or nesting in the ground just under leaf litter, which is why I also recommend leaving your leaves. And then squash bees like Peponapis prunosa. Basically on the top right are all the males. They hang out and congregate in the flower, which opens up in the morning, just waiting for one female. And it's like a big party when she comes. They're all after her. And then at night, they'll just stay there and hang out. The flowers close up. So very often, if you just kind of touch the closed flowers, you'll hear them buzzing all around. And the Peponapis prunosa is a solitary ground nesting bee, so we'll have her nest nearby, and she does a lot on the different gourds. Mason bees, are cavity nesters, making their homes in stems or tubes. And they're often the ones. I just wanted to speak about the hotels, because this hotel, Bee Hotel, was rated only a 1-star rating. They're great for educational purpose, but they can also attract predatory wasps. But this house is too short. You need length of tubes that are a minimum of 6 to 9 inches and come in a wide ranges of diameters from 1/4 to 1/2 inch. And so the tube length often determines the ratio of females to males that are laid. And if it's too short, those balance of the sexes will be off. A lot of times males are usually last or near the entrance, as they're more expendable. And it's also better if one end is closed. And so you need to take care of them, just like any hotel for people. They need to kind of be regularly cleaned. And so I think native perennial plants left, with their stems to overwinter make ideal homes. And that's what I usually recommend for folks. But what you can do is just planting a bunch of these flowers. Again, I'm new to Arizona. I'm not as familiar with your flowers, but if you provide a diversity of colors, our gardens and farms can play a really vital role, so that there's plenty of food sources, both pollen and nectar. And native plants that are locally sourced are better adapted to the environment and the climate. They've developed those relationships with pollinators over many years and have better disease and pest resistance. And they might take longer to get established than your annuals, as much of their energy will go down into their deeper roots. But once they're established, they come back every year on their own, and they'll support a lot of wildlife that they've evolved with over the years. And so, roses, things that come in a variety of colors. If they have different bloom times throughout the season, that's also very helpful, so that especially early on in the spring when they first come out, or later on the fall when they need all those resources before some of them go hibernate into the winter. And there's even studies that show that plants and bees have electronic charges. And so when the bees fly through the air, there's friction, and just like it happens when we shuffle our feet in our socks across the carpet, can build up a positive charge. And so when the bees are near the negatively charged pollen grains, they're attracted and will naturally stick to those positively charged bees. And so the bees, when you see, sometimes will come to a bunch of flowers like these, and they'll just, some flowers they'll visit, but others they won't. And so they can recognize when the plant's energy field has recently been discharged or visited, and so it will move on to the next flower. And if you plant flowers that come in a variety of different shapes, that is also very helpful, because long tubular ones are good for hummingbirds, or the long bees with those long proboscis. And so it would be very helpful to do that, as well as planting them with flowers that come in a lot of different sizes. And when we plant our native plants, they're usually good for other pollinators or other insects, other birds, our monarchs. And so if you can check out your local resources for native plants, that's usually what I recommend. And I do want to mention just about natives versus cultivars, because many flowers in the nursery industry have been, developed for their color, their double blooms, or special shapes or characteristics. And cultivars are usually the plants with, in the apostrophes at the end of a name. And so when they're bred for certain characteristics to please, our tastes, very often, sometimes, the breeding has taken out those pollen or nectar sources. Or things like this pansy, for example, it's really pretty, but has no pollen or nectar. But I did however, find this mating couple of Osmia cornifrons between the petals, which is also known as the horn-faced bee or orchard bee. And so, some bees can see certain wavelengths of color. And so when we change those color characteristics in flowers, it can impact how those bees visit flowers. And when you think of how much energy those bees use without much time to collect, they need to be efficient. And so, but these two found another use for it anyways. And if you aim to have 70% all native plants, forbs, or shrubs, this is something that Doug Tallamy says will be enough to sustain, a healthy environment for the caterpillars that are needed to feed a family of birds. And so also consider your native shrubs and trees, for that matter, to that. And to that, this is just a pollinator map, which is really fun to do with kids, where you take 10 minutes and just map out the different flowers in the area. Um, and basically just follow the path of a bee that you see and trace it through. And this really demonstrated to me very clearly the idea of flower constancy, as bees will stay with the same flower before changing to another, and why it might be more beneficial than to plant the same plant in bunches, opposed to planting one plant here, one plant there, and one more further out. That can be helpful too, as it is very often in nature. And the other thing too, rethinking weeds. And in the early spring, there's usually not much blooming unless you have some, spring ephemerals. And so I would suggest that you allow many of your weeds to flower and provide those very needed pollen sources of pollen and nectar for the bees. You can always deadhead or remove them after flowering. And then just being very cautious, being aware, because I know as gardeners, we often love to share plants with each other, but you need to be very careful because it's so easy to spread diseases or pests, or, like we have jumping worms, that are devastating areas here. And so check with your invasive plant organizations to make sure you're not adding in Arizona invasives. And we may be able to control plants that are, they're still beautifully attractive, to our pollinators, but they create havoc, especially in our state and national parks, where most of the budget goes to controlling those invasive plants that spread like crazy and smother out our other native plants. And so diversity to me is the best for native bees and for most wildlife in general. It's more resilient, it's more adaptable to changing climates. It can be really beautiful and fun. And honeybees can forage away from their hive up to 6 miles, but native bees like Perdita are tiny and they'll fly within 100 yards of their foraging sites. So you need to make sure you also provide those nesting sites to be near the food sources within your yard. And I've mentioned having those open unmulched ground, limiting weed barriers, having those trees and shrubs that provide the food and shelter, and providing cavities like your stacks of rocks, your walk walls, logs or twigs, bricks with holes, and then allowing these natural plant stands and stems to stay up over winter. If you can leave the leaves, many of the bumblebees nesting sites have been found just under leaf mulch in the ground, and just limiting those weed barriers. And one of the biggest things you can do is really to avoid the use of pesticides or herbicides, because in this study, the two main pesticides found in bee pollen in non-agricultural settings were household insecticides. And so, it does get everywhere. And if you can buy and grow organically, plants, if you can, many large production of native plants will use actually pesticides or even neonicotinoids that are harmful to bee pollinators. So make sure when you go to your nursery stores or box stores that you be sure to ask first how they've been grown, or if they do have those. You can plant them right next to your vegetables. Many of them are perennial, so you won't have to buy and plant them every year. They'll once they're established, they'll use less water resources, which I think will become much more important as they're adaptable to those climate extremes and weather. And you can use organic pest methods such as crop rotation or companion planting to avoid the chemical use, and get better pollination of your fruit and some of your vegetables. And then the last thing is, just in the last 20 years, these light emissions have increased by maybe 70%, especially in residential areas. And I don't know if you've driven out in the country, even in remote agricultural areas that might seem dark, they're affected by that sky glow from the city light. And so it can reach hundreds of miles from its source. And if you've seen, I don't know if you've looked at porch lights, insects are attracted to and seemingly hypnotized by these artificial lights. And when they collect around these lights, it removes them from their natural ecosystems and they become easy prey. And it, I think just like people having, if you sleep with the light on, it can also, there's been studies showing it impacts their reproductive capacities or cycles. And so, if you can, nocturnal visits to pollination visits were 62% lower than in unlit areas. And so LED lamps are used like in our, standard public street lighting. So if you can keep that light down, even though I know, we like to illuminate it with solar things, the illuminated plants will be visited much more rarely by the pollinating insects at night. And so the best thing we can do is keep those lights off. Or if you need to get lights, have ones that shine down and not up. And or if you have timers or dimmer switches, or you can turn them when they're not in use, or choosing bulbs that have longer wavelengths, like with a red or yellow tint, will usually be not as attractive as the white ones for our pollinators. And so hopefully you can become a pollinator partner with all of us and create these habitats and growing more flowers, not using those pesticides. And if you can share that information, I think that would be a great way for us to just create these community corridors that are just connecting all of us, all of our pollinators, especially for our migratory pollinators and birds. And so hopefully there'll be, I don't know if there'll be time for questions, and
we have a few, Diane. What excellent presentation. I love bees, and I've learned so much from you tonight. So thank you so much for all your work in putting this together. We have a few questions I want to get to real quick. Paula asked, what is the best way to attract mason bees?
I think for mason bees, because they're cavity nesters, if you can leave your stems up, they'll use those stems to lay their eggs, and then they'll stay in there, but then leave them up at least the next spring or summer. So if you can leave as many of your stems up as you can to overwinter, that would be best for the mason bees.
And Corey asked, can you tell me about when the solitary bees will come out of the raspberry canes? I cut mine down in the spring, but I hope it was late enough for them.
Well, they'll lay those eggs in there, and then they'll stay in there, and so they'll come out the next year. So if you've taken them down, you've probably taken them away right now. And that's why I'm saying, if you can leave them to overwinter and at least stay up to the spring, some of them will actually come out in the summer. And so, having those sources there year round, or at least just a few, could be helpful for that too.
Okay. Mike and Lois I have a permanent winter supply for the bees, and boy, do they line up for it. I guess it's a comment, not a question.
I'm sorry, what was that? I missed that.
A comment. I have a permanent water supply for the bees, and boy, do they line up for it. So
absolutely, especially out there, I think, because it's so much drier. I forgot to mention that. That is a bigger issue out there. If you have little ponds and things, they usually recommend putting little stones and things that are just out of the surface so that they don't drown in the water. Very often they'll get caught in the water and drown. So if they have little platforms in the water that they can kind of go in and climb out of, that's helps with them getting in and out of those water sources.
And just as a suggestion, I have gathered through the thrift stores, like Stepping Stones and local stores, just very, platters and stuff. And I glue them onto a hockey puck, put a steel plate on them. So they're very shallow and wide. And every morning I put some water on it in my bee garden. And there's tons of bees. I can see they don't drown, but at least they get their moisture. Yeah. And I also noticed all the little cavities in the ground. So I don't overwater my back slope, but I do water it enough that the ground is moist enough that they can get into the ground and build their cavities. And I had a question on that, if and when we get a monsoon again, and it's torrential rains, what impact does that have for the ground dwellers?
Well, a lot of the ground dwellers actually, will line their nests with linings, and so it can make them somewhat waterproof. Okay. And so, but sometimes it can flood out an area, but usually they're sealed in there fairly well, and then they'll just dig their way out and come back out. So.
And when you talked about the myths of bees, is it true that if a bee stings you, they will then die?
For honeybees, yes, because they'll lose their stinger. So a lot of their guts get pulled out with that. Okay. Things like wasps, they can do multiple stings because there's no barb on it. But not all bees will die once they've stung you. So, and you know, I think some of the wasps can sting multiple times as well. So yeah, that's not always the case.
All right, I think that's all the questions we have. Diane, we have a lot of kudos to your presentation. When I download all the information, I do get all the chat box. I will send that to you so you can see the comments and
Great.
the information that people gave to you.
Great.
So
Thank you so much,
this was
everyone.
a
and thank you for your
wonderful
help.
presentation. Thank you so much. You know, I love bees. I've heard lots of presentations, but I've learned so much from your presentation tonight.
Thank you so much. All right.
And that wraps it up. And don't forget, on Thursday, July 1st, we have our next presentation on grafting. The flyer has been sent out, but we will be posting it again, and we look forward to seeing every one of you. Thank you so much for attending tonight.
Okay. See you again soon.
Okay,
Bye.
good night, everybody.
Good night.